world has serious problems from the point of view of conflict, serious problem from the point of view of inequality, serious problem from the point of view of climate, serious problem from the point of view of, no guardrails in relation to technological development, namely artificial intelligence. The world has serious problems. And of course, the UN has to deal with those serious problems. And we are making an effort in order to reform ourselves.
Hello everyone, welcome to a special GZERO livestream presentation coming to you during the 80th General Assembly of the United Nations. I'm Julia Chatterley. This programme is part of the Global Stage series, a partnership between GZERO Media and Microsoft. As we just heard from the Secretary General Antonio Guterres in an exclusive interview with GZERO Media, the stakes could not be higher as 193 member states convene here in New York for another milestone meeting. Wars continue to rage in Ukraine, Gaza and Sudan. Geopolitical competition and shifting power dynamics continue to challenge desperately needed global cooperation. And to all of that, of course, we can add a widening gap in adoption and diffusion of artificial intelligence tools that will shape economies for decades to come. Now, the good news is I'm joined today by a panel of leaders uniquely qualified to address some of the biggest questions of the day. I'd like to welcome Ian Bremmer, President and Founder of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, Brad Smith, Vice Chair and President of Microsoft, Secretary S. Krishnan from India's Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, and Ambassador Philip Tigo, Special Envoy on Technology for the Republic of Kenya. And last but not least, Rebeca Grynspan, Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and the former Vice President of Costa Rica. Thank you all for joining us today. Ian, I'm going to start with you. The United Nations turning 80. I think multilateralism has proved to be far more complicated than just shared realizations and greater good actions. It feels like a turning point. Is it, and what kind?
I think it's less of a turning point than people fear. The United States remains the most powerful country in the world, and it's much more unpredictable. In many fields, it's much more unreliable because so much of it depends on what the individual president happens to decide at a given moment. But the response to that is not, globally, we don't like our existing institutions. The response to that is not, we want to build new institutions. It's actually, these institutions really matter. Just today, the big news that came out of the world today was multilateral news. It was Indonesia signing a new trade deal with the EU, a critical step to get ASEAN together. The Brazilians really worried about the United States right now. We'll see what happens with that 22nd engagement that Trump and Lula just had.
39.
Before, it might be 39. He said both. He said both.
It doubled.
So maybe it's 30. We'll give them the over/under. But the Brazilians are trying to engage in better trade relations with literally everybody. If the U.S. can't be counted on because they're an ocean away from Ukraine, well, the Europeans are going to have to spend a lot more. And even the Chinese, who usually are the last to put their dues in the kitty, so there's always a big liquidity problem for the UN. This year, they actually paid up earlier. Why did they do that? Because they want to show that they're more responsible in an environment where maybe they can put themselves forth as saying, no law of the jungle. We want, sort of rules that we can all adhere to, and those Americans can't trust them as much as you can trust us in Beijing. So it's not like we're heading to World War III. It's not like multilateralism is all falling apart. It's just that there's a lot of uncertainty because what happens with the biggest country, people really don't know.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that as well and the evolution of the United Nations in a moment. But I do want to come back to today because we have touched on it briefly, and we'll step aside the prompt to fail and the escalator issue, which I think has already gone viral around the world. What did you make of what the US president said today? I mean, he's transactional in terms of policy, but we are 8 months in now. Trump 2.0. What does this mean beyond the United Nations?
Look, he's transactional, but he has things he believes in, right? And those things do ground and orient him to a degree. And we heard some of them today. He really doesn't like and is kind of scared of nuclear weapons. He really wants to end wars. He's very proud of the fact that he's had some influence in bringing some of these conflicts to a close. Things like Rwanda, DRC, and Thailand, Cambodia. there's never been a president in my lifetime that's mentioned Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Thailand and Cambodia as much as Trump has since he's taken credit for actually ending those wars, right? Now, he's upset that he hasn't been able to succeed on Gaza, which he blames Hamas for, and Russia-Ukraine, which he mostly blames Putin for, actually. But it's not stopping him from saying, as he just did, this is important, this is a focus. So that's one thing. The second thing is sovereignty. Sovereignty and the ability to do what you want to not only protect your borders, to make them inviolable, but also to make them coherent, homogeneous, and reflect the national culture and maybe the religion that you believe in. And look, that is not, his view is very different from the view of many of the 190 plus countries that are there. But the Europeans have had many of these same issues as the Americans, and he's quite popular on this in the United States. So you saw him leaning in. Final thing, tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. He's a real believer in American power to change the global order in a way that is less oriented towards free trade, is more oriented towards his rules. That's the one that he's actually having the biggest challenge on, especially because China has the cards. Didn't mention that in his speech, but the one country that was able to say, no, we're not going to do it your way, was the Chinese, and he had to come back and say, okay, let's find a way to deal.
I thought we were going to get through a whole Q&A there without mentioning the trade or tariffs word, but you got there. We got there in the end. Secretary General Grynspan, wade in here, please, because obviously one of the biggest global challenges, I think, that's emanated from the United States is tariffs and the complications and the uncertainty on trade. Just how challenging has it been for some of the emerging and the developing markets?
Well, this is a tectonic shift in the trade regime. Yes, let's not cover it. And the good thing is that negotiations have substituted a tariff war. We have avoided, for the moment, a tariff war, and there are negotiations going on, and that's welcome. Now, for the most vulnerable countries, this is really tough because they are not negotiating, they are not in the table, they don't represent anything in the U.S. deficit or in the revenue or in terms of national security. And so our call has been spare the vulnerable countries from the impact of tariffs and from the cost for them that is very high according to their very least developed path, and there is no reason to really hit them so hard. And many of them are facing tariffs that are even higher than the main traders with the U.S., yes, without representing really a threat to the U.S. So maybe a second look, a call to the U.S. to look back on these countries that are vulnerable, and there is no need to hit them this hard with this high cost for them that will be, for some of them, will be devastating. It's
interesting that you call a sort of general rise in tariffs a negotiation rather than a tariff war. But I see what you're saying. Brad, come in here because we're going to come back to this too. What about for the private sector and multilateralism? Because, I mean, we're at the stage now where there are numerous technology companies, yourself included, that are significantly larger than nation states. And the impact of technology and the proliferation of it around the world is significant. How do you view this moment and Microsoft's role, technology companies perhaps in general, and the private sector more broadly? What's the role today and how has that evolved?
Well, I'd say two things. First, it doesn't matter whether you're a large company or a small company, you're still a company. You're not a government, you're not a country, but you do need to navigate a very different world. And so you see companies of all sizes seeking to do that. Business tends to grow best when there is a level of stability and certainty. That's what enables investment. And I would pick up on this last comment. I think it's encouraging for the business community when frameworks emerge, when agreements emerge. And as we've seen that start to take root as the year has progressed, I think that's helpful. And the more progress that can be made, the better off all of us who do business will be. And then I do think we can use our voice in appropriate ways. I think that when wars are ended, that is good for peace and prosperity and investment. And so, to have this focus by, heads of state in different parts of the world, including by the American president, helping to end wars, that is helpful to all of us. And I think it's the kind of thing that we should use our voice to support and applaud when there is progress.
By saying there's an opportunity here if the war ends, that the investment will flow, and sort of sending that message even before it ends. Vital.
And I think it is why you see so many companies in New York this week, because bilateralism matters. Sovereignty is different in 2025 from, say, 2020 or 2015. Digital sovereignty is important to countries around the world, but so is multilateralism. And so is the opportunity for the United Nations to play in a more effective role in the world. And I thought it was interesting that, in effect, President Trump talked about the opportunity for the United Nations to be more effective. I don't know anyone who comes to New York this week who doesn't see some opportunity for the United Nations to become more effective.
Oh, we're going to come back to that too. Oh, what a leaping off point. Ambassador Tigo, first, I want to get your voice in as, a voice of the continent, but also what role you see a significant swathe of the global South playing in the future of multilateralism, whether that's via the United Nations or otherwise.
Thank you so much, really. And just a data point, right? So it's 80 years of the United Nations. 80 years ago, very few African countries were independent at this particular stage. So we're never part of the San Francisco Charter, but yet, as we speak today, it's the global South that carries the United Nations. If you look at any landmark resolution that has come out of the UN in the last 1.5 years, that was by consensus, was actually driven by the global South. So for me, it shows right front center that the global South values the United Nations. And I dare say that it's the only space right now that the global South has for multilateralism. The second part, of course, and I think Brad has mentioned this, is many of the global South countries have been calling for the reforms of the United Nations. And part of the reforms of the United Nations is to realize that, yes, there's multilateralism, but there's also multi-stakeholderism. That 80 years ago, private sector was not on the table, yet we know now that we cannot work without the Microsofts and the colleagues who are helping us push a lot of these new and emerging technologies, which we neither own, neither do we build. And so unless part of the reforms is to figure out that no government can do this without private sector, civil society, academia, and no global South country can do this without the global North countries, then that is where we begin to fail. So I think I agree with Rebecca's point that part of this conversation is also a reimagination of 80 years post San Francisco is what is this new imaginary we are seeking that is not about global South or North, it's about humanity, it's about peace, it's about prosperity, and it's about common good and public good as we seek it. And so I think for us, that's where we sit.
And at the core of that is trust.
Yes.
I think whether it's between governments and the private sector or between the North and South, which you can elaborate on how we build that too. Secretary Christian weighed in here. How does India help shape the future that we're talking about?
I think India is a very key partner in the way that we are able to bridge some of this gap between the rest of the global South. We are a part of the global South, and with the global North, with companies and elsewhere. Simply by sheer size and by the way that technology has emerged in the country. There have been lower cost solutions in terms of digital public infrastructure, which we are then able to sort of offer to other countries in the global South in terms of what in the technology space we can actually create and we can support to create, and how that can sort of help a wider cross-section of people. So I think what India really offers is the role of a bridge. And we don't take the same positions that sometimes is expected of us. We take positions which we believe are in the best interests of the country, and that is something that we can't walk away from. We deal with situations as we find them, but technology in that sense has been the big leveler, and technology has been the one space where I think a lot of this collaboration can actually take place. And the point that Ambassador Thigo just made about multi-stakeholderism is very, very critical. The way technology has grown and the way the internet grew and the way that was anchored by a multi-stakeholder framework. And now when you're coming to AI and the way that AI would then impact the rest of the world, and we just came off another meeting where we were discussing precisely this, I think the multi-stakeholder approach is very important. You need the private companies in the room, you need academia in the room, you need civil society groups in the room, you need everyone working together to make it happen. That way you get a broader cross-section.
This is why UN Week's so great, traffic aside, because people do get all in the same room and are all in the same place to have these conversations. We're going to pause there for a moment because I do want to let you listen to another voice on this. It clearly is a moment which is a referendum on the shifting global order and tensions surrounding ongoing wars, but it's also a moment of deep introspection, I believe, and as we've discussed, a review of how the United Nations itself can operate. GZERO Media interviewed UN Under-Secretary General Guy Ryder recently about the UN 80 initiative, which could bring dramatic cost-cutting and structural reform as the institution marks this 80th anniversary. Here's a part of that conversation.
I think, you can look at the political divisions that we face, the heightened geopolitical tensions which are, evident to us all and play out in the multilateral space. Deep divisions over some very fundamental issues. So we have to navigate that difficult political moment. That goes with, and in some ways the result, has as a result financial constraints. We're seeing resources shrinking, both the regular assessed resources that the UN has and voluntary contributions. That's hit very hard in some of our most important areas of activity, humanitarian being the most obvious example, with real life consequences that I think should worry everybody.
Secretary General Grynspan, to you on this point. The Sustainable Development Goals, in particular, to some are an abstract term, but they're vitally important for the people that have benefited from the work that's been done. Can you continue to operate and achieve and reach for those kind of targets with the spending cuts that we now know are coming and have already hit?
Let's say divide a little bit the general picture for the UN, because we are really worried about the humanitarian, because that has a direct impact on the life of people today, of women, of children, of people that are sick, and that is suffering a lot because of the cuts in the cooperation sphere. It's not the cuts in the bureaucracy that is affecting the humanitarian work, it's the cut on the work itself with the people that needs it. And there, I think that we need more help to really support the people that are so vulnerable today, and that the humanitarians get to them in the most effective way. In the rest of the system, with respect to our structures, let's put it that way, I think that we have discussed a lot that there are duplication, there are synergies that we can use much better, that we can work in more efficient ways. We are not perfect. And every institution has to look at themselves, after a while and reform. I think that to be multilateral today is to be a reformer and not the opposite. Now, we want to reform, we don't want to destroy. And I really see my own institution. We are cutting 20% in the jobs. We have done it well. We have really kept the core of the organization untouched, and we have focused more. And I think that we can be more effective if we put our work together to make it. And it's also about believing in ourselves. Yes, it's not only trust, it's also hope that we need. Yes, we have to be hopeful that we can, even with the AI and the digital world, we can be more effective. I remember coming to UNCTAD and hiring the first data scientist that we have ever had in the organization, yes? And now everybody is talking only about AI and only about the digital and only about the revolution, yes? So we have to catch up. But I really believe that we can do this well. You have two choices, yes? Or do it well or do it badly. And I think that we have to put our energy, our creativity to try to do it well. And UNAID is an important step towards that.
I think your positivity and your optimism is infectious, which I love. But I'm going to pull one thread out of there, which I think is a very important point that you made, which is about focus, about targeting, and about efficiency gains. Your suggestion is actually similar perhaps to how the private sector operates. And Brad, you were nodding at this point in particular. That institutions like this can be more efficient in the way that they operate. And I think that's crucial. And the second question really to this is there a role for the private sector here, whether it's to help with the efficiency gains or to perhaps step into the breach on some of this?
I think our most important contribution is to help with the efficiency gains. We do actually step into the breach to a limited degree by actually being a private donor to different agencies of the United Nations, including financially at times. But you'll never see, I think, the private sector fulfill that whole. On the technology side, however, one of the ways that entities in the private sector, especially over the last 25 years, have typically become more efficient is to use technology to deliver services. And I think to some degree, every one of us, whether we're a company serving customers or whether we're a United Nations agency providing services to beneficiaries, you always want to look at how much benefit are you providing and how expensive is it for you to deliver those benefits. And technology is typically a tool that helps advance that equation so that a higher percentage of what an agency is spending is actually creating benefits that translate into real world outcomes and impacts for people. We do a huge amount as a company across the United Nations system. There is real progress being made. But ultimately, obviously, as you said, there's an opportunity for more, and this is the time to embrace this. And by the way, this is not unique to the United Nations. No. There are departments of every government, including the United States government, that really haven't been reorganized since the 1950s. A lot has changed since the 1950s.
Yeah, there are updates that can be applied. I don't want to gloss over the humanitarian aspect of this. If we're talking about a greater level of suffering, perhaps a greater level of migration, you began this conversation talking about the impact of the US president's words on controlling borders, and I think that is a message that resonates all around the world. It sort of complicates the challenges that many leaders around the world are facing, even if they choose to look the other way and say, hey, we're not going to contribute to it. It makes a lot of the battles harder to fight, surely.
Well, certainly a lot of this is money.
Yeah.
I mean, the UN can reform itself, but if countries are not paying the dues that they are committed to paying, if they're not, actually making good on their obligations, then you are going to see massive holes in the humanitarian aid that's desperately necessary. And the same is true for USAID. Americans have decided they don't want to spend the money on foreign aid, which they've spent historically, which, I mean, frankly, is relatively small in terms of the U.S. budget, but it's massive in terms of the total amount of aid that is given globally. And those two things are leading to more people facing hunger. They're leading to less ability to deal with the results, the consequences of the far greater amount of 123 million people today that are forcible migrants, essentially. They don't want to be in these places. They are because of conflict, because of disasters, and yet you don't have the capacity to respond effectively.
Very quickly, I think I know what you're going to say to this, but I'm going to steal some of Secretary General Grynspan's optimism and say, could this be NATO-esque? That the US, I can see it already, the purse strings are tightened and in the same way that we've seen NATO nations, and I admit there's some creative accounting we believe there, are suddenly spending more on defense. Could it be a similar way that actually saying, hey, we're not going to give money to the United Nations because we don't believe in the way that they're operating right now, and actually it ends up being beneficial?
The reason, Julia, that I'm not as optimistic there is because the Europeans are spending more money on defense because they feel it's existential for them.
Yeah.
Because you have countries that are seeing drones come into their territory, because you have jet fighters that are entering their territory because they think that war is actually threatening them. So they are spending after not spending for 30 years. They don't feel that way. Wealthy countries don't feel that way about what's happening in Sudan right now. Perhaps they should. But if it doesn't affect them, I mean, the fact that Trump's speech was so much about sovereignty, what happens inside your borders, that's what they care about. And that's increasingly what the Europeans are caring about. And that's, even China, the speeches given by Xi Jinping, so much of that is self-reliance and self-accountability. Israel saying we have to be Athens and super Sparta. We're focused on us. We're going to be more isolated from the rest of the world. Those kinds of discussions, right, not only do they potentially cause the kind of beggar thy neighbor policies, which Secretary Grynspan is working so hard to try to combat and fight against, but they also lead to them not having adequate resources. And what Brad and I have been doing so much work on trying to discuss over the past few years is, if those resources aren't there, then will these new technological tools that are being developed have a much greater impact and opportunity on so many of these people in the global south? Because otherwise we're in big trouble.
Yeah, you're not going to see the proliferation that you'd hope for. Ambassador Tiga, you're nodding.
No, for sure. I think for us what's the cost of inaction? Right? And the more I listen to these conversations, the more than I listen to my president, is pushing for a renewed multi-stakeholderism, a renewed sort of reforms of the UN.
What does that mean, though? What does that mean, really?
Because if you think, as I said, we were not there 80 years ago, right?
Yeah.
You have this institution that was built that did not reflect the global south and the global majority. Many of us were under colonialism. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to bear every mark of who we are. And the majority of the challenges that are in the global majority, yet the majority of the resources are in the global majority. So as much as we are seeing a lot of these things moving around, for us, the burden of history has been exclusion from opportunity. And sometimes that opportunity is simply being on the table. And that's how we
not being in the room.
Not being in the room, right?
Yeah.
So people making decisions.
Expansion of the General Assembly.
Exactly. So,
okay.
And in most cases, and I think for us, that's what we're saying. And at this time and age, we need a new type of leadership. A leadership that even reimagines, which is interesting, this question of sovereignty, because for us, we believe sovereignty in this era must be defined by independence in an era of interdependence. You can't be both. You can't just be one thing or another. And that's why, especially when it comes to technology, when we talk about GPUs, when we talk about data centers, you can't isolate yourself in a world that is already, by the way, interconnected.
One sentence answer, because I'm being pushed for time. Does that independence come via technology?
If we are part of the design.
Yeah.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're left in the cold.
Otherwise, you're left in the dark, yes.
Secretary Christian?
No, I think the one point that got made about the reform of the United Nations, that's something that everyone is looking forward to, as much as India is, that it needs to really represent the power structures that have emerged since, the people who were not nations at that point in time. India herself got independence in 1947, 2 years after the UN Charter. So I think all of this needs to be sort of reckoned with, and part of I think some good will come out of this process in terms of the UN itself emerging as a reformed institution which better represents the world as it is today. So that's one part of it. The other part of it really is technology gives the other opportunity. Today we communicate so much more easily from one country to another, from one geography to another, without having to actually physically go one place to another. And there's so much of data which flows, so much else which flows. And even, say, a company like Microsoft or any of the other companies wanting to establish data centers across the world, wanting to be, they tell us that technologically data is now stored in such a way that it's bits of it, shards of it literally, are stored in different data centers across the world and come together to service a request. That's how interdependent technology is really making us. And so that's time at which I think countries need to sort of figure out what sovereignty is about, what data sovereignty is about, and how all of that comes together with the way that there is so much of interdependence that we can't do without the technology which is across the world, and it comes from everywhere. These are global value chains. Nothing gets made in one country. It's not just the software, it's not just the programming, but it's just even the equipment. It sort of comes from across the world, and it has roots everywhere. So if you're going to disrupt that mechanism, that's going to be quite expensive, quite costly for everybody.
A new layer to diplomacy, data center diplomacy. We'll come back to it. It's the perfect stepping off point. I do want to move on now and overlay all the challenges that we've just discussed with, as the Secretary was saying there, a development challenge and an opportunity clearly every leader here in New York is facing. And obviously I'm talking about the impact of artificial intelligence and the highly uneven growth and adoption rates we're already seeing around the world. Now, there's good news. More than 1 billion people around the world are now using some form of AI tech on a regular basis. Of course, the bad news in that is that leaves 7 billion people who simply aren't. Now, ahead of this live stream, GZERO surveyed its followers across all social media channels about some of the issues that we've already been discussing and will do. Here's the first poll question. What's the biggest barrier to AI adoption in less developed nations? Is it cost and infrastructure? Is it lack of skills? Is it regulation? Is it trust and ethics? Well, here are the results. You can probably guess this. 66% saying cost and infrastructure, 16% saying lack of skills, 5% saying regulation, trust and ethics, 13%. Ambassador Tigo, I don't think that surprises you at all.
I'm not surprised.
In fact, probably a little low, on the low side, perhaps.
It's very low.
2/3 saying cost and infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like any other industrial age, right? Infrastructure defines who accesses, who doesn't access. As I was mentioning previously, Julia, 666 million Africans still do not have electricity.
Right.
That was the second industrial revolution.
Yeah.
So for us, basically, I'm not surprised. So we need to invest in the infrastructure. And when people say infrastructure, they actually mean access. This is sometimes, if you look at your survey, they say they just can't have access to any infra that they can use AI. And this is not even utility. You haven't even talked about whether they use it productively or not, because also that's another question. So people just want to get onto this train. But you want to get on a train with no rails. So we really need to build the rails so that the train can run.
Right away in here, because it is a layered approach. It's access to electricity, then it's internet connectivity, and then you can layer further on there.
Absolutely, and that is exactly right. There's a foundation on which AI can be built. It needs to be built, and there are these 3 layers. First, you have to have electricity.
Yeah.
There's 700 million people in the world that don't have it. Then you have to have internet connectivity. When you add that group, now there's 2.6 billion people who can't use it. And then you need a base level of digital skills. When you add that, you're now at 3.9 billion people out of roughly 8 billion, so call it almost half. Half the world doesn't have the foundation. Now, if there's a silver lining in the current situation, we have an unprecedented amount of private capital flowing into data center diplomacy, data center economics. And what's interesting is when a company like Microsoft or any other goes in and, say, builds a data center, well, you have to invest in more generation of electricity. You have a new economic self-interest from the market to expand connectivity. So you take a company like ours, among other things, this decade, we pursued a program in partnership with others to bring internet connectivity to 250 million people, including 100 million people in Africa. That's good news, and it won't do everything. We will need public-private partnership, we will need public policy, we will need different kinds of blended or public funding, but that's the strategy we need to pursue, because I do think we should recognize what's at stake. AI will either help close the great divide economically in the world, or it will make it wider. So we need to seize the moment and harness this for all we can.
Secretary General Grynspan, you're nodding furiously. Come on here.
No, I think that probably the challenge is we know we need those things, but we need those things all at the same time. Yes, we cannot have the connectivity if we don't have the electricity, or if we don't bring down costs, because costs are very high, even if connectivity is there. So many people don't have the possibility to connect, and we need the skills. Because if we do the infrastructure, if we do the connectivity, but we don't have the skills, anyway, we will miss the opportunity. And really here, Microsoft is really putting a lot of effort in the skill part, and I understand that you have a whole program for building skills. I think that that's huge, and that's very important. But we need the other 2 components to come with it. We need the electricity, and let me say this. with electricity, it's amazing that so many millions of people today don't have access to electricity. It's a technology that we have had for so long, and they are not connected. So let's learn from the past, and let's make sure that it doesn't happen to us again. It can happen to us in terms of digital and AI. So we can lose the opportunity for the diffusion of the technology to be strong enough to really bring everybody in the new era. And still we don't see that in the least developed countries. Yes, they are not connected. It's still very costly. Investment is not coming to them. The perception of risk is still too high. And that's why we call for the multilateral development banks with the private sector to be able to bridge that gap and make possible that the resources will go also to the countries that are not making it right now because they are small and because they are perceived as too risky.
Secretary Krishnan, I want to hear from you, but I want to hear from you on our next poll, which is quite fascinating. One of the questions that we asked GZERO followers is, can less developed nations, bearing in mind everything that you've just heard, leapfrog with AI like they did with mobile technology? So think payment systems, for example. The answer, options, yes, huge potential. The second, maybe in some areas. Third, no, the gap's going to grow, as we've heard warned here. Fourth, unsure. Here are the responses. 26% said yes, there's huge potential for a leap. 50% said maybe in some areas. 20% said no, the gap will grow. 4% said they were unsure. That blows my mind. 76% of people saying yes or maybe there could be some kind of giant leap using AI technology.
So I am not alone.
You're not alone. Secretary Krishnan, how are you going to make it happen?
No, I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
You're right. Exactly.
I mean, for countries like India especially, I mean, when I look at India, and we are 1.4 billion people, if we don't use this technology to become a developed country in about 2 decades or thereabouts, which is what our goal is, 2047, when the Republic is 100 years old or 100 years from independence. If we don't do it in those 20 years, you will actually grow old without ever having grown rich. And that is something which is critical. You have to use your youth, you have to use the opportunity you have now. And the potential is there, the opportunity is there. And you have to find low-cost ways of innovating. You have to find means of doing frugal innovation to actually make it happen. We can't afford the most expensive way in which technology is built, and I think that's what happens with AI in particular is like it's life going in fast motion, because issues seem to sort of come at you with great rapidity. At a time when everyone thought it was going to be extremely expensive to do it, suddenly the costs crash. Suddenly, you can do it with fewer GPUs, you can do it with fewer parameters, and it's evolving rapidly. And I think that's been our experience too. And there, I think, clearly is a possibility that this time around we could leverage this technology, and we have to leverage this technology to move ahead and take the global south along with this movement, make sure that we find ways of offering on a technology basis, much cheaper way of actually moving forward. And that, I think, of course, the foundation is important. Of course, electricity needs to reach all people. But you must realize that with each wave of technology, the speed with which it is moving forward is also growing. Today, in India, for instance, 1 billion people have access to the internet or access to that kind of technology. So which means that we found other ways, and we are in a funny way, 90% of the world actually accesses internet through broadband. 90% of India accesses internet through mobile technology. So there are ways in which you can do it which is different, and which could be significantly cheaper and significantly quicker with less investment in infrastructure. I think that's a lesson which it offers, and that's the way in which we need to move forward. And we can't afford to miss this opportunity.
Oh, there was so much in that. Ian, I want you to come in. There are several points that it underscores, I think, why we talk about this as an AI arms race, because you simply can't miss this version of the technological wave, whatever nation you are, whether it's as a government or for your citizens or for the suggestion that you can die having never got rich, or at least raise the wealth of your nation, which I think is the important part there. There's also data center diplomacy. You pick your partners in a very short space of time over how you're going to do this, and you want to be with frenemies or friends, not enemies, as you do so. What does this mean for the geopolitics of the moment?
Well, first, this isn't just a global South problem. I mean, in the last months, we've seen the Europeans recognize that they don't have these companies, that they've focused more on regulation. They haven't focused as much on growth and industrial policy, and now they're shifting because they see what the Chinese are doing, they see what the Americans are doing. They're saying, oh my God, they're having the same kind of conversations right now that the Indians and the Kenyans are in Europe, right? Because otherwise, they're not going to own it. They're not going to own it. They're not going to make it. They're not going to have it. They're going to be takers, not makers. So this is truly, it's about people that aren't aligned with it. It's about countries that aren't aligned with it and how fast they can actually get there. But I'm less worried about the frenemy issue. And I'm less worried, not because the Americans and Chinese are slowing down, they're not, they're speeding up. But the fact is that other countries around the world refuse to have to make significant stochastic choices, right? They're not saying, I'm gonna line up with the United States on everything, or I'm gonna line up with China. Mexico maybe has no choice, okay? Cambodia on the China side maybe has no choice. But for most countries out there, when the Chinese are like driving the world-class technological changes in post-carbon energy, and the Americans are driving world-class changes for all of these technology hyperscalers that are in the private sector, other countries in the world know they have to work with both. If the Chinese are your biggest economic trade partner, but the Americans are actually providing you with defense and security, countries know that they need to deal with both. And so the fact that Trump is focusing more on sovereignty and the Chinese leadership is focusing more on, we have to make sure that we have a big market ourselves, we have to invest in it, we need to make sure our economy works, we need to have political stability. Other countries are going to find ways to work with everyone. That will undergird multilateralism, and will also create space for countries like Kenya and India to avoid capture, which is super important. You talk to the Indian and Kenyan leadership, they do not want to return to a pre-independence environment, either in reality or informally, and I don't think they're going to have to.
Yeah, so the advantage of not being the United States and China is hopefully you can play both sides and take opportunity from both sides. Quickly, Brad, on this, not everybody surely needs to be using AI. It goes back to the point that Ambassador Tigo was saying about, you know, in a way you can be targeted about this, and you have to work out how many of those 1 billion people that are using it are actually productive with it. How do we make it targeted for the nations, for the companies that actually can't afford to just throw money at this? Because I think this is an important calibration that perhaps we're not making enough today.
Well, a couple of things. First, I'd build on what you said. The first thing I think for countries around the world to recognize is the real contest economically is not to produce a better GPU, but to use more GPUs per capita, but for more beneficial uses than anyone else. And that's the real, I think now, undisputable conclusion as you just look at the history of technology over 250 years. And then in particular to look at it in terms of how you drive productivity growth, look at the strengths a country has now, how do they make them stronger, and to really equip a new generation or an existing generation of people to put this to work. Kenya and India are two of the real technology success stories of the last 10 or 20 years. Kenya as really the IT leader of not just East Africa, but virtually Africa as a whole now. India is one of the great digital superpowers in the world. It's all based on talent. And I think that's the part that one shouldn't forget. It is educating people and then equipping them with the specific skills to go deep. This shouldn't be about turning AI into, say, as you put it, trivial uses. It can't be just the next generation of watching more YouTube videos. It's got to be using AI to drive real innovation that benefits each country's population and the growth of its economy.
Or AI picking what YouTube videos you watch, which could be more dangerous. All right, we're running out of time. Sort of last comment. Is the 80th anniversary then of the United Nations actually a reason to be optimistic about whether it's working together on AI, whether it's understanding some of the challenges, and that reform can be good? I think I know what your answer is going to be, but we have one sentence to do it. Why are you most optimistic about this point in time and where we're headed collectively?
Because in this transition time, there are forces that go in all directions, and we can choose to go in the right direction. Not everything is written. We don't know where we will land. It will depend on what we will do, and this is an opportunity to do the right thing.
We have choice.
We have choice. An agency.
An agency, better. Ambassador Teague.
Well, we have community. Let me add another word. Because I see more multi-stakeholderism now than ever before. I mean, we're sitting with companies, we're sitting with researchers. Our meeting in the morning, I couldn't believe that at UN 80, we can actually sit in a room with everybody and actually talk about innovative financing for capacity building for the global majority. So I'm very hopeful.
Okay.
I think it's really the choice that you have and what you can choose to do, which becomes very important. And I think there is, in addition, a third way, literally, in the way that the world can actually move forward and use technology to enable that. Because, sovereignty is important, the independence is important, the choice that people have is important. And that's what ultimately even development for any of us is about. How do you expand choice, both for the country and for individuals? And that's truly what we should be aiming at, and that's truly the way that technology can enable. And clearly it has to be used for productive uses. It has to sort of raise productivity, raise efficiency, and that's something which can happen.
Choice and opportunity. Brad?
Well, I would really echo this. I mean, optimism or pessimism may affect how you feel when you wake up in the morning. But what really matters is whether you act with determination to get something done as the day goes on. The most encouraging thing I think about New York and the United Nations right now is that people are asking the right questions. That's the only way you ever get to the right answers.
Ian, make good choices.
We're here in New York, and this United Nations General Assembly is the most important collection every year of the world leaders. And overwhelmingly, the people that are here, that are collected here, they want to be constructive. They want a better future for their people and for the people of the planet. Now, maybe the United States right now is not at the leading edge of that. And that's sad, given that it was the Americans that created the United Nations 80 years ago. But the world matters. And the fact that all these countries can have these conversations and collect for the common good, however inefficiently, is really utterly critical. And that's why we're doing this right now.
Yeah. The United Nations is just a collection of 193 nations that all have responsibility for change. The most constructive panel ever. Thank you. That's all we have time for today. Although I probably, as you could see, could keep these guys talking for a few more hours as well. I want to thank Ian Bremmer, Secretary General Rebeca Grynspan, Brad Smith, Secretary Krishnan, and Ambassador Teague for sharing your insights today. Thank you. And once again, this has been GZERO Media Livestream and part of the Global Stage series, hosting conversations just like this one at the intersection of technology, politics, and society. Thank you for watching.